It just happened to work out that as we were getting close to time for the conference, that I was able to press the accelerator down on my, it's on, Mel, isn't it? It is now? Okay. I was able to press the accelerator down on my publisher to get them to get my book out just in time. It arrived here Wednesday, I think, so we were able to have it here. And it is pretentious, obviously, for me to put myself up as a speaker next to Bishop Spong, but I'm kind of crazy that way, so we just did it. It's cheaper, yeah, we're not paying me extra, so it all works out. But my book was generated after our YouTube audience grew quite large, and I was getting lots of emails every week from people asking the same questions over and over again. And I thought, I should just answer all those questions and have an essay that I can then email to everyone who asks me, well, what about prayer? Or why is this a priority? Or what about the environment? Or what about this or that? So I listed the topics that I felt like I had to answer the most often. And that turned into 16 essays that became 16 sermons that became a book. Not much of a book, a small, slender volume, but it answers the basic questions. I think Bishop Spong called it my manifesto, which is close enough. If I'd known that's what he was going to call it, I might have asked for a red cover and have it printed very small where people could just hold it up at conferences. But it has been handy for me in that sense that people do tend to ask the same sorts of questions. And the whole issue of what is progressive faith. And even when we started, we talked about progressive Christianity, and we don't even use the word Christianity as often anymore because it's really a matter of progressive faith. What does progressive faith look like? And it's not Christian in any sectarian way. I mean, as I was saying yesterday, you have to stand on a mountain to view a mountain range. So we do talk about things from a Christian perspective out of that language set, out of that set of understandings. And it's the language that we speak by and large. And so it's easier for us to deal with these things always by making those comparisons and references that way. But we're trying to become more easily fluid in the languages of other great faiths of the world. Now, it's not an easy thing. I teach a world religions course every semester for Drury University, and I find that because I don't talk about Islam except for 6 weeks every semester, that it gets cold for me. And Bishop Spong and I were talking about languages the other day. In undergraduate school, I studied French and Spanish and German. In graduate school, I studied Hebrew and Greek. And I could take one of my business cards, turn it to the blank side, and write every foreign word that I know on one side of that card. Because I don't have an occasion to use it. And I discovered in Paris that speaking a little bit of French makes them hate you even more. That it's just better to shrug and point than to speak French badly. And a friend of mine over there, I was visiting in Montreal, and I talked about the wonderful French restaurants I went to in Montreal. And she says, they do not speak French in Montreal. So, okay, all right. And I've also learned, because most of my Spanish work, scuba diving is my hobby. So I go to the Caribbean to dive as often as someone will pay for me to go, which is always nice to have rich friends. And then I do relief work in Nicaragua. I'm usually in Nicaragua once or twice a year, and I've discovered that the formal Spanish that I study in classes at Drury University does not work well in the jungles of Matagalpa. It's a really different approach to Spanish. So once again, I speak Spanish about the way Tarzan speaks English. You know, me eat now. You know, it's about that, and there's some similarities that are kind of tough, like cansada and cascada and casada. One is waterfall, one is married, and the other is tired. And at the end of a building day, I kept announcing that I was a waterfall. And they're like, he brought the money to build the houses. If he says he's a waterfall, he's a waterfall. So just whatever. But it is bad when your excuse for not working anymore that day is because you're married. I don't know how they interpret that. But at any rate, it is difficult for people, especially here in the Midwest, where religious diversity is really not part of our easy language. There is a Jewish synagogue here in town that went so far as to move about 20 miles out in the country so that they didn't have to do guest appearances in Christian Sunday school classes anymore. We just recently had a Islamic house of prayer built, not a mosque, but a house of prayer, and one of our locals burned it down pretty quickly, but it was rebuilt by area churches, which was nice. We have a Buddhist temple now, but it is a Vietnamese Buddhist temple, and the services are in Vietnamese, and they don't really care to get curiosity seekers in there. So I'm just saying it's difficult. But I think just as a decision, you make a decision that you're not going to pretend that only Christianity is right or only Christians have those insights, that we're going to very intentionally work on trying to include these other faith traditions in our language. And so we've had guest lecturers in who would do a single talk on Buddhism or Confucianism and Islam, and we try to move along and grow in that area. Do you have any, I haven't done any Q&A. I'm going to do a talk on poverty, about why poverty is a priority in progressive faith. But do you have any questions or comments about my previous lectures or addresses, or any questions that you have about the existence of this congregation or its life? That's what I love, It's one-way communication. I'm so clear when I say what I say that there's nothing left to wonder about. In my chapter on our preference for the poor, I began with the fairly radical claim that money does not exist. Money is not real. Money's a concept that we have, that we print currency, we coin stuff, but it really doesn't exist. The philosopher Alan Watts used the analogy of a carpenter who came to work one day and was told that they were not going to be able to finish the building that they were working on because they had run out of inches. A carpenter builds out of lumber, but you measure it in inches, but inches are not real. There is no such thing as an inch. Inches are a concept. Money does not exist. Money is a concept. It's used to measure or estimate the value of things, and it makes it easier to exchange or trade in objects or labor or energy or land. But as a thing, it's not a thing. Actual wealth resides in resources like land, rare metals, energy sources, food, water, building materials, labor, vehicles. And labor, I shouldn't have said that quite so fast. Labor is a resource that has intrinsic value. Money is the concept that we have invented to help us to distribute real wealth. Currency only works if we agree on the system that it symbolically represents, the economic rules that create it. So real wealth is created when real estate is basically fixed. I mean, you can change the character and value of real estate, but it's basically fixed. So wealth is created when we build something, when we grow something, when we're able to mine something out of the earth, when we can assemble something, added value. You take raw materials and put them together and have added value. But unfortunately, our economic system allows for a great deal of wealth to be transferred into the hands of people who do not create wealth. They simply have made this system of economics work in their favor in a way that they then get the people who are generating real wealth to then turn it over to them. We were talking at breakfast this morning about the whole concept of estate taxes. And you use the right nomenclature. You call it a death tax, which sounds absurd. How can you tax someone when they're dead? But the truth is that estate taxes prevent the accumulation of wealth into a handful of super wealthy families that impoverishes the rest of the country. But there's always that argument, and the argument is typically made from 2 or 3 bad examples, like if you're a rancher out west and your family's lifestyle is ranching, and so you want to inherit the ranch from your father when he dies, and the ranch is worth $6 million, and if there's a tax on your estate that begins, I think now at $3 million, you might have to sell the ranch, and that would ruin your lifestyle. Well, my daughter would tell you that she's used to someone cooking and cleaning for her and paying for her car and her insurance and her phone, but that we reached a point, about when she was 24, when we said, your lifestyle is no longer valid, that you don't get to perpetuate that lifestyle. And I understand there are people that will take those rare examples of someone inheriting a very valuable ranch or farm and say, we want to keep that in operation or even a business. But the fact is, without a major estate tax, wealth will eventually accumulate in the same hands of an oligarchic power structure, and it impoverishes the rest of the country. So when you have an economic system that begins to slow down, i.e., when someone is so wealthy that they drive all the cars that they've ever wanted to have, they own as many homes as they want to own, they've got a private island in the Keys somewhere, they've got everything that they need, they're not going out and buying another pair of shoes. They can only wear 1 pair of shoes at a time. They can only wear so many tailored suits. So the economy slows down, and when we idle workers, when you have an idle workforce, you're not building, growing, assembling, mining, you're not farming, then real wealth goes down. The overall wealth of the world or of a nation, look at it in whatever size that you want to. I oftentimes say it's best to think of an island with 100 people on it. If you've got an island with 100 people and nobody's got a house, nobody's got a farm, no one's got a food source, how are you going to manage this island? Will you build 3 houses for one family before you build a house for everyone, so that everyone has housing? Of course you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't allow for one person to become obese while another person starves. If you can look at it in the economy of scale, logic kicks in, and you begin to be aware immediately of how it should be managed. Part of our problem is the anonymity of our system, that I've got a pension fund. I have no idea what that pension fund is invested in. I get a huge statement every once in a while that makes me sleepy just taking it out of the mailbox. So I don't know. I despise the way that Walmart treats their employees. I despise their merchandising of slave-produced materials. Do I own Walmart stock? I don't know. And I'm sure several of you are thinking, I know what's in mine and I wouldn't have any. Well, most of us don't manage our finances that closely. So there's this tremendous anonymity that we don't know where stuff comes from. And so it becomes very possible then to lower wages, to outsource to slave production methods. My daughter is Korean. I adopted my daughter when she was 4 months old, and it wasn't until I adopted her, and she was born in Korea. The reason there were so many Korean children being sent to the United States initially was because of the Korean War, but after that, the industrialization of Korea put plants in major cities, and the families of peasants came to the cities to get jobs in the plants. So young people that couldn't survive on the family farm went to these plants where they worked every day, lived in dormitories, worked 12-hour days, and they were without supervision or guidance. And so put enough teenagers into a dormitory unsupervised, and there will be some extra babies. This is how this works. So that's where almost all men's clothing comes from. And I didn't know that until I had a Korean child living in my home. My robe, my vestments that I sometimes wear, I won't wear today, but sometimes I wear, made in Korea. my church vestments made by slaves, my shoes, suits that have nice British-sounding names, Hart, Schaffner, and Marks, made by slaves. And you start looking in the labels and you think, wow, do you know you can't eat a banana in the United States that wasn't harvested by a slave? You think you wouldn't support slavery. You wouldn't make the decision to support slavery. But Mel and I have been down where those bananas come from. That doesn't look like a very fair agricultural circumstance, does it? And even fair trade coffee. You want to buy fair trade coffee. Well, Mel, how fair does it look to you? It doesn't look very fair, does it? I mean, fair trade may be better than not fair trade, but it doesn't look right. So when you have an economic system in which profit is the driving force, you are constantly shifting assets into the hands of fewer and fewer people, and thereby you idle larger numbers of people. Mel and I have done a lot of work in Nicaragua with the Rainbow Network, and the coffee industry employs a lot of people for a very brief period of time in the year, and the rest of the year they are left to forage. All the decent arable land, most of the water has been taken up, at least in the Matagalpa region, by the coffee industry, which pays them a salary about 5 weeks of the year. You know, there's some other regular stuff, but most of the rest of the year, they are literally foraging for food unless there's someone that is providing staple resources for them. So it's a very dangerous situation. When the Hebrew prophet Isaiah, which is what his mother called him, I think in church it's oftentimes Isaiah, but he was speaking poetically of the way that the world should be, how it would be if God were in charge. So he says about workers that they will build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat their fruit. They will not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. Now that's a description of an economic system. The remnants of Israel had been living as slaves in Babylon. They built houses for other people to live in. They gardened and grew crops for other people to benefit from. And their distant memory, most of our Pentateuchal accounts are written by these slaves in Babylon, and their distant memory was that they had been slaves in Egypt, that they had been enslaved by the Assyrians. They longed for justice, and to them, what justice looked like was an economic system in which the poor got to have a major share in what they produced. In ancient times, as well as in modern times, there's always been so much pressure placed on an economic system to give a smaller and smaller share to the people who produced, while the people who were doing to the people who owned the assets, while the people doing the producing get a smaller and smaller share of it. So that a banker who does not generate anything, doesn't make anything, doesn't grow anything, doesn't mine anything, doesn't assemble anything, but they stand at the gateway of where finances are moved from one instrument to another. They can create instruments that pay them handsomely, but do not give a return to the people who had actually worked to generate those assets. So from time to time, societies find that they have to restrike a balance between the rich and the poor, or the entire society will collapse. And this scenario has been repeated on every continent of the world every so often. So are we moving to a point of economic collapse because of the transfer of wealth into the hands of a smaller number of people? And what would it look like? Would it look like how much unemployment, homelessness, hunger, sickness will a country like the United States tolerate before there is an actual open rebellion? Often, what keeps a society from jumping off the cliff is the voice of a prophet of the religious community that tries to encourage a civilization to turn back before they destroy themselves. The liberation theology movement among Catholics in Latin America of the last century gave us the phrase, God's preferential option for the poor. They noted that throughout the Old and New Testaments, there was a distinct preference given to the poor by God through the prophets, through the apostles, through the saints. For those of us in the progressive movement, this awareness of a spiritual concern for the poor can be traced to our choice to see ourselves as being connected to one another in a way that makes feeling the pain of others unavoidable. Now, I understand, I think Bishop Spong coined the phrase, the Church Alumni Association, that I think one of the greatest hazards of liberals, of progressives, is the sense that once you have arrived at an informed liberal opinion, that you have arrived, that that's it. You now have a sophisticated worldview. You read interesting books. You subscribe to the New York Times, or at least you act like you do. You pretend that having an informed opinion now changes the nature of the world. That is not true. Only when you take that informed opinion and you combine your energies and resources and awarenesses with others, only when you are organized, labor unions, churches, neighborhood associations, political parties, it is only when we associate with other people with similar ideas that we are able to actually accomplish something. We have no shortage in our time period of politicians who unashamedly cite the self-centered philosophy of Ayn Rand. Rand liked to call her views objectivism, and some liken it to libertarianism. But it reminds me of simply I got mine philosophy. I mean, you see these people that are protesting against the Affordable Care Act, they've got insurance. So if 20% of Americans do not have access to health care, but you do, then you can take a sign and object to affordable health care. And that is a reasonable choice if you buy into objectivism, if you buy into the sense that if I'm okay, if the system has worked for me, why should we change the system, regardless of what the casualty count is all around that system. Now, most of us live in a world between the extremes of absolute selfishness and of absolute self-abnegation. I've always found it cute that there's so many born-again Christians when that's only mentioned once in John, but there's not many I sold all my own and gave it to the poor Christians, which appears 3 times in the synoptics. That conversation happens. Why aren't there more I sold all I own and gave it to the poor Christians if you're really going to want to distill Christianity down into those kind of formulas? But very few people do it, and we can typically name them. You know, you can say someone like Mother Teresa lived in that kind of poverty. St. Francis lived in that kind of poverty. At the other extreme, you have the Silas Marner or the Ebenezer Scrooge, but not many people are made of the kind of stuff that Francis was made of or Mother Teresa was made of, nor are we really embodying the kind of radical views of an Ebenezer Scrooge or a Silas Marner. But there's a whole lot more people leaning towards Ebenezer Scrooge than are leaning towards St. Francis. Not because it's mandated in Scripture or because it's part of a romanticized view of poverty, but because progressives have chosen a life that is defined by radical compassion. So we cannot simply sit silently by and give our consent to an economic system that goes on all around us that unfairly, unjustly, even irrationally impoverishes the many to enrich the few. If you listen to the political rhetoric of our day, even a casual observer would conclude that Americans absolutely hate to pay taxes. We are inclined to vilify the lazy that live off of public assistance, while rarely questioning why the top 1% in America is taking 25% of the money that is earned in our country. And sometimes even talking about the 1% misses the real issue. It's the 1% of the 1%. That when wealth starts to accumulate the way that it is in our economic system, just a group of people that could meet in this room manage the disposable income of over half of the national product of our country. We have an economic system that looks fair, but is in fact stacked in favor of the rich. It's like if you were going to play Monopoly, and I think our generation all played Monopoly, didn't we? If you're going to play Monopoly with 3 friends, but the friends start playing 30 minutes before you arrive, and you join the game with the same rules, same economic rules, the same buy-in from the bank, the same set of dice. They just started 30 minutes before you. So they've already bought up the income-producing spots. Then no matter how hard you work, no matter how smart you are, no matter how careful you are, you will turn all your money over to them because the system is rigged for the people that have the assets to take from the others. Increasingly, our system of economics will prevent the poor from ever being able to work their way out of poverty and will erode the middle class out of existence. I grew up in a very lower middle class home in rural Kentucky, but in 1974, I was able to go to college at a state university, work part-time for minimum wage, and finish a college degree. That can't be done now. State universities are no longer getting the kind of support they used to get. Even when I did have to take student loans, which I don't know whether Vanderbilt was the best divinity school in the world. That's difficult to say objectively. What we do know by the numbers is that it was the most expensive, that you had to borrow more money to go to a school that ironically was located in Nashville, Tennessee. I don't know how that ever happened, but I left with a master's and a doctorate and $50,000 of debt, which I thought was crushing. 1989, I finished my last degree and I had $50,000 of debt and I wasn't sure how I was going to live. Well, now $50,000 wouldn't get you through undergraduate school if you have to borrow that much. We have a member of our church here who went and got a PhD at a local school of psychology, and her student loan payment is higher than their house note in their new house. And so you literally sit down and say, can we have a child? Because we've got a huge house note and a huge student loan payment that we will make for the next 20 years. That will kill our economy by taking everyone but the children of the wealthy out of the ability to even receive that kind of education. Those who resist, Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, preached that we need a revolution in how we think about the distribution of wealth. She said our problems stem from our acceptance of this filthy, rotten system. What economic commentators insist that when they say that we cannot pay a living wage, why is there a difference between the minimum wage and the living wage? What does it mean to have a full-time job and not be able to live on it? What does that even mean? So we accept a system in which we're being told that you cannot make the minimum wage a living wage. Then what we're saying is that we are willing to buy into a filthy, rotten economic system that discourages the creation of real wealth in favor of simply transferring existing wealth into the hands of fewer and fewer people. They are asking you to accept a system in which they have already won. They started in the monopoly game before you ever showed up, before you ever got to roll the dice. They have already won. Those who resist increases to the minimum wage or who insist upon legislation that undermines labor unions, that protect workers' jobs, wages, and benefits, often cite studies that conclude that it is the greed of teachers and firefighters and labor union members and selfish young people that want to go to college that is threatening our economic future. And they use these studies, as Paul Krugman likes to say, the way a drunk uses a lamppost for support, not for illumination. The stock market continues to climb to new heights, making the rich even more rich, while real wealth remains virtually stagnant, or in fact is declining in the United States, eroding the middle class and undermining the economic future of the nation. We have been sold a malignant myth that wealthy people are job creators. That is ridiculous on the face of it. Rich people do not hire new employees unless there is consumer demand that makes having another employee more profitable. Demand in the marketplace is what creates jobs, and demand comes when people have the money to buy things. Still, the far right cries out against labor unions, against a president that they are labeling as a socialist. If Barack Obama is a socialist, he is the worst socialist that has ever drawn breath, because there has never been a time in the history of America when real wealth was being transferred into the hands of the rich faster than under this socialist president. Naomi Klein, describing the documentary The Shock Doctrine, about her very important research into what she calls disaster capitalism. The right uses those phrases like death taxes and stuff like that all the time. And I think we shouldn't just say capitalism, we should say disaster capitalism, because that is what it is. She says, "We are witnessing a transfer of wealth of unfathomable size. It is a transfer of wealth from the public hands, from the hands of government collected from regular people in the form of taxes, into the hands of the wealthiest corporations and individuals in the world." Needless to say, the very individuals and corporations that created the crisis. And to which I would add, the very corporations and individuals who write the tax code. You know, we talk about having all of these crazy tax loopholes and stuff. Well, do you think employees at Burger King created those tax loopholes? Who is creating the tax loopholes? The people at the very top of the income stream are the ones that are influencing the legislation. The system that is set up to enrich corporations and is controlled by the same corporations will never be able to become something that will work for the welfare of the whole nation. But what system would work? What could save America's economy? Thankfully, economist Robert Reich has a very plausible answer. The system that we used in the United States between 1947 and 1977, a 30-year window of time when we built America's middle class and we created the standard of living that has been the envy of the world. Reich says in his documentary, Inequality for All, that if you look back over the last 100 years, you see a pattern. During periods when the very rich took home a much smaller proportion of total income, during that 30-year window from 47 to 77, the nation as a whole grew faster and median wages surged. We created a virtuous cycle in which an ever-growing middle class had the ability to consume more goods and services, which created more and better jobs and thereby stoked demand. It was, at that time, a rising tide that lifted all boats. Conversely, Reich points out that when you allow the greedy to control the system and grab most of the assets for themselves, the whole system crashes. Reich says, during periods when the very rich took home a larger proportion, as between 1918 and 1933, and in the Great Regression from 1981 to the present day, growth slows, median wages stagnate, and we suffer giant downturns. It's no mere coincidence that over the last century, the top earner's share of the nation's total income peaked in 1928 and 2007, just before the great crashes. We tend to assume that great religious leaders were all very poor and that spiritual people must therefore be suspicious of wealth. Frankly, I think that's counter to what really alleviates human suffering. Sure, again, you go back to that island with 100 people, and if you've only got 100 apples, then no one should eat 10 apples, right? However, that's not our problem. Our problem is that we have put the apple growers out of work and fired the people that pick apples. While progressives do not trade in the guilt and fear of past religious years, there is still such a thing as evil. I think we've sacrificed too much when we try to ameliorate all sense of personal guilt and responsibility. Evil still exists. It is evil to be so greedy that you hoard resources in a way that puts some people out of work, forces others to work for poverty wages, and leaves many living at the edge of death. That's not evil just because some holy scripture says so, even though it does. The Bible itself talks about poverty issues and social justice more than any other topic. But forget Scripture. Put all of that aside. Look at the world. Look at what this economic system creates. It seems most likely to me that whatever there is of heaven or of hell in this universe is what we do in this life. Therefore, having devoted ourselves to seeking the greatest good for the largest number of people, it only stands to reason that we're going to work in an organized community way to defeat, improve, replace a dirty, rotten economic system that creates widespread suffering for the benefit of just a few people, and grow to an economy that puts people back to work, makes the basics of life available to everyone. This is the only way that we can keep from turning what we have of heaven into the hell on earth that we do not want.
Amen.
Thanks. Now, thanks. Oh, please. Do say more. Another chapter in my book deals with our prison nation, and this is related to the economic system as well. And there's some very key points about that I think we really must become aware of. And my good friends Ron and June Hertenstein were moving to Florida just as I was starting to do the research for this book, and I pointed out to them that there's a university in Florida that now has a stadium that is named by a for-profit prison. That the for-profit prison system in Florida has become such an economic powerhouse that they were not ashamed to donate millions of dollars to a university to be able to put their name on a stadium. But we have derived an education system. Let me just see where I am. We have an education system in the United States that's unlike any other developed world, where our schools are funded by the property taxes around the school, in that school's area. So in very poor areas, we have the worst funded schools. In very wealthy areas, we have the best funded schools. Now, how do you think that's going to turn out? By having the worst schools in the most impoverished areas, kids who already don't have cultural advantages, are not being able to travel globally or get out or have other cultural enhancing experiences, they are becoming locked into a peasant class, while the kids whose parents have already made the system work for them are getting the very best schools. It should be the opposite, right? The wealthier areas should subsidize the poorer schools, if we can say that we do not want to create a permanent peasant class. I mean, a lot of the, we were told when we were in school that coming to the colonies was in search for religious freedom. There had to be at least 7 or 8 people for whom that was true. By and large, people came to this country for economic opportunity because the economic system in Europe had funneled the wealth in the hands of a few, and there was a permanent peasant class. If life was going real well for you in Europe, you probably didn't get on a dangerous boat and come to the colonies to start life all over again. There were some examples of that, the people that thought they could become even more wealthy. But by and large, the United States was an economic opportunity for the people of the world. Now we are turning our economic system into the reason why people left Europe in the first place. And we worry so much about immigration at the border and illegal immigration. And the truth is, right now, for the last few years, there are more Mexicans leaving the United States than are coming into the United States because there's no good economy here to attract them. Now, there's still lots of migrant farm workers and a lot of that sort of, still if you got fresh sheets on your bed in a hotel in Branson, you can bet if you don't speak Spanish, you're not going to talk to the person that's changing the sheets. That does still go on. But in terms of numbers, as our economy has fallen off, that immigration issue is not so much there. So we have invented a school-to-prison railroad, a fast track, that we send kids from poor neighborhoods, high crime, high drug use neighborhoods. And again, Stigmatizing poor neighborhoods as high drug use is a little bit inaccurate because that's where drug sales take place. The rich people drive into the poor neighborhoods to buy drugs. A lot of these shootings of the wealthy people in bad neighborhoods, they never really say, now what were they doing? They were buying their cocaine there. That's the market. But you have kids in impoverished neighborhoods going to completely inadequate schools who are then fast-tracked into a prison that's being run at a profit. And we have grown our prison population. It was around 500,000 in 1980. It's 2 million now, quadrupled in size. 2 million in a country of 380 million. So that's a lot of people. Part of that is isolating an unneeded part of the workforce. Our unemployment figures would be much worse if those 2 million people were suddenly released from prison. Why are they in prison? A huge percentage of them are there because of the drug problem. We switched from a war on poverty to a war on drugs. And I don't think we talk about what was going on during President Johnson's tenure enough, because the war on poverty was working. The war on poverty not only had high-sounding ideals, but it was working in many areas. But the resources for the war on poverty were transferred to the war on drugs. Now, if the war on drugs were working, if we've been able to eliminate addictive drugs, and I don't want to get into pharmacology here, but the difference between marijuana and methamphetamine is huge. So if we're talking about going after the production and distribution of methamphetamine, I'm for you. If you want to imprison college students for selling pot to each other, that is 32 flavors of crazy, and it has got to stop. Now, I was in college for half of the 70s and all of the 80s, and I never smoked pot. And if they legalized it today, I wouldn't start today. I have no particular interest in it. My life is complicated and hard enough to figure out as it is without being high all the time. So I have no particular interest in it. But imprisoning people for personal use of non-addictive recreational pharmaceuticals is crazy, just crazy. So we've got to not just address the economic system, but we have to address the system that creates poverty. For-profit prisons, drug laws, the cutting of taxes on capital gains, where someone who doesn't work, we say that we believe in capitalism. You're not a capitalist if you're going to work for a salary. That's not capitalism. You have a job. Paris Hilton is a capitalist. She has money invested and lives off of the investment. So Paris Hilton doesn't work. She simply has assets and lives off those assets. But she is taxed at half the rate of the income of, let's say, a corpulent cleric in a Midwestern city. That's an economic system that is designed by the fabulously wealthy and puts people out of work and creates a permanent peasant class that we don't want. It affects education as education cuts come down the pike. Again, why is it that a state university has to charge tuition at the rates that it does? Now, I teach as an adjunct professor, and being an adjunct professor is something like having leprosy in the ancient world. But they pay me $2,800 to teach a course. Every student in the room pays $3,000 to be in the room. They tell me they can't afford to keep paying us so much. And if I teach a class with 25 students in it, I can't even do the math off the top of my head. How much profit is Drury University making off of that? A lot of money. But I don't know where universities send all their money. I just know that tuitions have gone up and up and up, and it becomes impossible for the poor to go to school. So I'm going to end with that unless you've got any questions or comments. Yes, ma'am.
I have a comment.
Okay.
Our deportation centers are rarely
And I've been asking some of my friends, because they do report on the crisis of children being put in virtual dog kennels and housed waiting for deportation. And I've asked the question, who can do anything for these children? You know, there are all kinds of church agencies trying to raise money. The Red Cross is trying to raise money, and they name this, and I'm like, okay, let's say I give $100 to UMCOR, the United Methodist Relief Agency, or Catholic agency that works along the border. What can you use that money for? Because if these kids are being held in federally operated detention centers, that doesn't mean that they're going to let you bring them a better meal or another blanket or an inflatable bed. Yes?
They're not federally operated. Private corporations run these people.
Under contracts to the federal government.
And they get paid per head.
Right.
So they're very anxious to keep people from being
Yeah.
sent.
Yes, yes. I understand it is privatized, but I would love to know. I would do fundraisers if I thought there was an organization that was actually doing something. And someone wanted me to donate to a Lutheran charity that works with it. And I read all their material, and it's like, you know, they've got all these preachers that are going down to the border to see it. So it looks like all of their donated money is paying for the hotel rooms and travel expenses of preachers to gather along the border and wring their hands and say, isn't this awful? I think it was Wesley who said during a preaching conference that preachers were like manure. Spread around, they can do a lot of good, but you gather it into one place and it just stinks. So I'm not sure. Yeah, Mel, you probably know more about this than anyone here.
Our two children in Dallas, Texas are involved in this. A Methodist, I use the denomination, a Methodist judge and the system requested 2,000 of the children to come into the Fort Worth, Dallas area. They're being housed in rapidly refurbished, abandoned schools in the Fort Worth area. The Catholic Charities is much involved in this.
When you say they're involved, can the Catholic Charities, if they have resources, improve the circumstances of the children being held in the detention center?
Who's doing it? It sounds pretty good to us.
Catholic Charities do have one facility for the children that's been operating. Of course, that's just a drop in the bucket.
Yeah.
But they are, let's see, Save the Children is there.
Everyone says they're there.
Yeah,
Can they touch the children and change their circumstances?
I don't know. They are recruiting people to help. When the children come in, they will need to be escorted. So they will not be, well, treated like some people
Yeah.
are treated. I don't know, we're just waiting for the report to see when the kids get there.
Well, yes, June, please.
This man is probably someone not very welcomed in this area, but George Will, I thought, had a very good answer.
Which was?
We took the number of counties in this country. It would actually, each of us would only have to take about 20 children.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
How many is Springfield?
Yeah, well, listen, if I had a warehouse full of children, I could have them adopted out by 11 o'clock today. There are people desperate to adopt children. The problem, and I had read that piece by George Will, which may shock you that I read anything by George Will, but someone else had told me that George Will stopped being a completely crazy man for just a moment. But the government won't let, just because the kids show up at the border, that doesn't mean that we can adopt them. And of course, you all adopted Arena from Europe, and I adopted my daughter from Korea. That is not a small thing to get permission to bring a child into the United States. There has to be all kinds of documentation and legal loopholes to jump through to make that happen. It'd be a great idea. It just doesn't happen. Let me just say this to wrap up, if I may. If you find a solid suggestion of how to help those kids, you email that to me, and I will email it out to everyone else that's registered for this event. But every single nonprofit is willing to take your money. and they are willing to be very concerned about the issue. We're very concerned about the issue. I'm just not big on wasting donated dollars to simply replenish a fund. And there are certain agencies that always make money when a disaster gets in the news, even if they can't do a darn thing about it. You know, if you want to give me money for relief for tsunami victims in Southeast Asia, that's great. I will totally take your money. And if anyone shows up here from Southeast Asia that's a victim of the tsunami, I'm sure I'll help them. But that's oftentimes the way nonprofits work. And we've been on lots of nonprofit boards, and you know, there's an earthquake in Nicaragua, and we use the earthquake in Nicaragua to try to get donations for our work in Nicaragua, although what we really need is to fund the feeding centers and the schools where we're trying to change the future of Nicaragua, not just earthquake victims or hurricane victims. Yes, please, Ruth.
I went to the United Methodist Quadrennial, and the emphasis there was the sexual slave trade when people could get a hold of young children, boy or girl, and that they use them and abuse them. And so I think that's why the government is so afraid to let people take a group out.
Why wouldn't they trust the church with children? Ouch. Guys, it is so great to have you all. Oh, you want to make a comment?
Bob is very associated with this organization in St. Louis and Kansas City called Metropolitan Congregations United, which works on social justice issues. So if any of you are from that area, they're desperate for support. So you can talk to Bob about that. MC.
Okay. And just as a final thing, I want to thank you all for being so supportive of this event. And everyone has worked together so hard to do all the physical stuff to make it work. And I appreciate your allowing me even to assign myself a part in the overall play. It's been wonderful getting to share a microphone with Bishop Spong these last few days. And if any of you are part of a church that would be interested in any of these presentations from my material, please do be in touch with me about that. I was sharing with Bishop Spong earlier that it's ironic that all the invitations that I seem to get are outside of the United States, and there's only so much of that I can do. So if you are part of a congregation that would like to have some presentations from Progressive Faith and Practice, I would love to do it. The Kindle edition will be out soon. The audio book is out today, and we've got a few copies left here if anybody would like to have one. Yes, sir.
Have you set the date for next year?
Well, our anniversary is the first Sunday of August, and so that's why the conference has been on this weekend these past 2 years. We're afraid we're going to lose quite a bit of money on this one, so we will have to actually have a board meeting when all the bills are in and everything's paid to see if we can afford to duplicate it. But we will try, and I've got your email addresses, and I will let you know what we're going to try to do next year. We'll do something. Yes.
The cost for coming to this conference was the lowest cost that I've ever paid to go for 3 days.
Thank you.
And it appears that it is, I got my money's worth Friday night.
Okay.
And so yesterday was a bonus, and today is a bonus.
Yes.
So I think that many of us, even those of us who are on fixed incomes,
Yes.
would be willing to pay more to come to this 3 days.
Well, Annie, I really appreciate you saying that. Thanks. And it must also be said that, you know, I oftentimes will say around here, this is a church that if you read John Spong, John Dominic Cross, and Marcus Borg, Karen Armstrong, that we're the church that reflects them. Well, now, Bishop Spong is willing to come for, I'm not going to say it out loud. I guess I could say it out loud, what the fee is per day for your 2 lectures. Can I or should I? It's $3,000 to have Bishop Spong here for 2 lectures. For Karen Armstrong, 2 lectures is $160,000. So we, a tiny church on the edge of Springfield, Missouri, can have one of the world's leading religious writers and scholars because Bishop Spong is willing to do it at a rate for which he might be much more comfortable staying at his home in New Jersey. But it's his generosity that lets a little church like us have a conference like this. So, thank you. Yes. Yeah.
A practical note, Roger, following this up, that those of us here today could help make up for that cheap cost we have.
Well, yeah, that'd be wonderful if you can put something in the basket today that would help us to shore up the difference. But I mean, again, the Spongs are extremely generous. But an event like this with tents and again, if we had a bigger church or whatever, things would be easier. But for all the stuff we have to do to put on a conference, it ends up being fairly expensive. But we're happy to do it in as much as the people that do the books and make me sit in board meetings and hear about books are willing to play along. There's a reason why preachers usually are not put in charge of the finances of a church, is because I always think it can be done. It can be done. There's no reason not to do it, but they will occasionally send me a note about exactly why it's not going to be done. So there's that. But everyone here will get emails about what we're going to do next year. That really does have to wrap it up. I've got to let the musicians have a shot at their equipment to get ready for the service. Thank you all so much.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Reverend Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.